Well, welcome to my vegetable garden at the beginning of August, and I'm really excited to take you on a tour and show you around and show you the progress that I've been making over the last few months. Now, because we were away for a little while during July, I didn't do a plot tour, so the last plot tour you'll find on my channel will be in June. If you compare that video compared to what I'm going to show you now, I'm going to show you some absolutely fabulous progress on my vegetables. We're going to see some fantastic cucumbers, we're going to see how my tomatoes are ripening and how my peppers are getting along. I'll also give you an update on how my potatoes are progressing and also show you the other vegetables that I've been growing this year. Now, this year has been a particularly interesting year for me because for the first time I've been growing vegetables in my garden, and if you've been following the channel you'll notice that I've been transforming some of the areas in my garden to grow vegetables. And in fact, this area behind me last year was a hedge, and as you can see I've transformed that into a really productive growing space for vegetables. So I'm particularly excited to show you around the vegetable plot, to show you areas where I've grown veg that I've never grown before. Now, I'm based in growing zone number 8, right in the middle of the UK, and this year has been a really strange year for weather. I seem to be saying that every year actually, but this year in particular has been strange, particularly if I compare it to last year. In July last year in the UK, for the first time we reached temperatures of 40 degrees centigrade plus, and that's unknown before. But this year July has just passed and it's been one of the wettest Julys that I can ever remember. And the temperatures here have been typically low to mid 20 degrees centigrade, so completely different from last year. Now, vegetable growers in the UK will argue that the rain that we've had in July has been necessary because we had a very dry spring and a very dry beginning of the year, to a point where certain regions in the UK introduced hosepipe bans because of the lack of water. But even though the rain in July has been very welcome here, it has had an impact on our vegetables, as we'll see as we're going around. And if you compare the temperatures that we're experiencing in the UK compared to what's happening in other parts of the world in July, such as Central and Southern Europe, which have been getting record temperatures, 40s and 50 degrees centigrade, and parts of the United States have been getting really extreme temperatures, it does demonstrate the contrast in geographical areas. In the UK, because we're in the Northern Hemisphere, the weather patterns we're experiencing here are because we're just slightly above the jet stream, which is holding our temperatures to where they are and preventing us at the moment from getting these extreme high temperatures. But who knows what's going to happen over the next few months or even into the future. And what it does demonstrate to us as vegetable growers, that we can't take for granted that the weather conditions we experience one year are going to be the same the following year or the years after. And we very much have to react to those weather temperatures. So in the early spring, particularly when I was starting to develop my seedlings, I had to be very mindful of giving them the right amount of water. And when I planted out my tomatoes and cucumbers, as you're going to see in a minute, they required an awful lot of attention in that period because of the lack of rain. But thankfully, as you can see around me, there's an abundant growth of vegetables here, and the aroma in this part of the vegetable garden is particularly fantastic because just at the side of me here I have my celery, which I'll show you in a minute. So what I'm going to do is take you around each of the vegetable beds that I have around the garden, and eventually we'll go and have a look at the cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers which are at the top of my garden. So let's start off with this raised bed just here, which is the one right next to the hedge. This is the raised bed where I've grown all of my lettuce and rocket and a few spring onions this year, and just behind me you can see that I've got a wonderful display of lettuce that are ready for harvest. These fantastic lettuce here with the curly leaves are Lola Rossa, and the tall ones at the back there are a variety called Little Gem. And you might be surprised to see how tall they are, because most people harvest them when they are round about the same height as the Lola Rossa here. But the only reason they've got to this height is because I haven't harvested them. And over the last month or two we have been away and we haven't used the amount of lettuce that I would normally use, and therefore they've just grown on. Now if I let these continue to grow on, they will eventually go to seed, but at the moment they're perfectly healthy and I can cut them stems, and those leaves at the top are absolutely fantastic and flavourful. Interestingly, this raised bed is netted. The lettuce has found its way through, so I want to cut the tops off them and use those over the next few days. Now I have got some gaps in here, and you'll see when we get to the top of my garden that I've got 1 or 2 new lettuce seedlings that are growing, so I can continue the supply through the rest of the autumn and into early winter. Now go in these spaces here. I need to give this a little bit of a weeding, but generally it's been a really productive raised bed for me, and I think that's because of its location. Yes, it has got this hedge behind it here, but for much of the day it does get quite a bit of sunshine. There's also a little bit of rocket here behind me, and I've harvested a lot of rocket this year and I just can't produce it fast enough, so I have got some more rocket which is growing again. You'll also see that later in my mini greenhouse. Really pleased with this raised bed, and now we'll move along to the next one. Now in this next raised bed here, I've got carrots, a variety called Autumn King 2. I'm always recommending this variety, mainly on the basis that I have very few problems with this variety, and if something's growing well, why change it? And just behind the carrots, I have a variety of dwarf French beans, and that's a variety called Ferrari. You'll notice that the dwarf French beans are now starting to get their flowers, and once they're pollinated, that's when the beans will start to develop. I can see one or two slight insect bites on the leaves at the top of the beans, but there's nothing there that's going to concern me. And you'll notice, just like the previous bed, that I've got bird netting on top of this raised bed as well. But the growth in this bed is absolutely fantastic. In fact, since the last tour, which I did in June, which is over 2 months ago, I've had to raise the netting, so this was quite low. And as the vegetables have grown, I've had to put larger canes in and put the netting over to accommodate its growth. So I'm really pleased with them, and it looks like I'm going to get a fantastic harvest of carrots and of beans. I'd imagine that the beans will be ready for harvest in round about 3 to 4 weeks, and the carrots probably round about the same time when I can start to pick a few. Obviously, the longer you leave carrots in, the larger they'll be, but very soon there will be some carrots I'll be able to pick and use. Next we come on to this bed here, and as you can see, this has got more substantial netting on than the other beds I've just shown you. This is scaffold or debris netting, and that's because in here I've got some brassicas. Brassicas do need protecting from insects and birds and all sorts of other wildlife, because they tend to be favourites for virtually everything, and if you don't protect them, they're not going to last very long. Now you'll notice just on the side here I can see a ladybird. Ladybirds are the vegetable grower's best friend, because they really love things like black fly and aphids, and if your vegetables are affected by aphids or black fly and you do notice ladybirds in other parts of your vegetable garden, then gently collect them in your hand very carefully and transfer them to the vegetables that have the problem, and they will help to deal with the problem because they love aphids and other types of small insects. Now notice in this bed that I've got 2 layers of debris netting, and that's because some debris netting, like the debris netting that I've bought, has these little holes in them, and because it's used for scaffolding and building works and it's tied to scaffolding, these little holes are where it's tied to the scaffolding, but they are a problem because insects can get in them. So when I use it for covering vegetables, if you have got a spare layer of debris netting, put it over to cover those holes as well. It just gives a bit of a belt and braces job. In this particular bed here, which is the bed probably in the whole of my vegetable garden that gets the most sunshine per day, I'm growing celery, a variety called Octavius F1, and on the right hand side I have kale, which is a variety called dwarf green curled, and in there as well there is a cabbage which is January King 3, because when I was growing them I had an additional cabbage and no space for it, so I put it in here. As you can see, this raised bed is growing really well. In fact, the kale is nearly to the top of the netting and the celery is not too far behind. The smell here is phenomenal. This celery smells amazing. I know the celery is not for everybody, but I love growing celery and it's useful for so many different things and so flavourful that I grow quite a lot of it. And this was started in seed. I think it was early March that I initially sowed the seed, and now it's at a position where I'll be able to start to harvest this very soon. So another raised bed that I'm really pleased with. I'm really looking forward to harvesting the celery and also the kale. Kale is fantastic as a crop because you can cut a few leaves off at a time and it will start to replenish rather than have to dig and harvest a plant at a time. So this kale here is going to last me all through the winter period. And kale very much is winter hardy, so it won't be bothered by those low temperatures and frosts. So it's a great crop to have in your garden through the winter period. Now something else I always recommend if you grow your own vegetables is to make your own compost. You can see here I've got a compost bin which I built earlier in the year in an area that would be very difficult to grow vegetables, and that's the reason it's located here. It's tucked in right at the back, surrounded by a lot of hedges, and yes, I could grow some vegetables in here, but they would struggle because it really is deep into the hedge. That makes it the perfect place for my compost bin, and as you can see it's starting to build up now with some grass clippings. I put leaves in there, some discarded vegetable peelings, and the vast majority of things that I'll take up from my vegetable garden and flower garden are compostable. Now there are a number of videos on my channel showing you how to make compost and what you can put in compost and what you shouldn't put in compost heaps, but it really is well worth doing because it's a completely free resource. I'll continue to build this compost heap, and when we get to autumn or fall and the leaves start to come off the trees, they will go onto the compost heap as well, and that with the grass clippings and other things I'll put in there will give me a good supply of free compost that I'll be able to use next year. It's particularly important in the UK because from next year 2024 peat-based compost is going to be banned. You won't be able to get peat-based compost in the UK any longer, and homemade compost by far will be superior to any peat-free compost that you might buy in the shop. Not only that, clearly making your own means you don't have to spend an awful lot of money, because compost can be expensive if you need to buy it. So if you've not made compost before, then I definitely recommend that you give it a go. If you follow the instructions on the videos that I'll put in the link below, it shows you how easy it is to make your own compost. And don't forget to collect as many leaves as you possibly can as we approach autumn or fall, because they're an amazing free resource in the vegetable garden. Now this particular raised bed is always an awkward one to film because it's tucked away right at the back of my vegetable plot. As you can see, it's in quite a shady area surrounded by this hedge here. And because of that, you do need to be mindful about what type of vegetables you're going to grow in shady areas, because not all vegetables will grow in shade. In fact, there's a video on my channel which I've recently published showing you some vegetables that you can grow in shady areas. So if you do have shady parts of your vegetable garden like I have here, then that doesn't mean to say you can't use them and they can't be productive, because there are certain vegetables that can grow in those areas. So I'll put a link to that video in the video description below, so check out that video if you've got shady areas in your garden. One vegetable that does particularly thrive in partially shaded areas is beetroot, and that's what I have in this bed here, growing really well, and it's just starting to bulb up as well, so it's starting to produce those lovely beetroots that I'll be able to use really soon. I'm growing two varieties of beetroots in this particular raised bed, one called Monetta and one called Boltardy. Both of those varieties I found to be very reliable over previous years. That's why, because I'm using this bed for the first time, I thought I'd try those in here. And as you can see, they're growing really well. So I've just moved over to the other side of my vegetable garden. As you can see here, I've got vegetables growing here, and the area behind me is empty. Now, as this is my first year growing vegetables in these areas, I've been very mindful about what I grow and where in the first year. The area behind me here, as you'll see, has got no vegetables. In fact, it's just full of surface weeds. And you might think, well, that's an awful waste of space. But if you watch earlier videos, you'll know that there were two conifer trees in here that have been here for years, and it took me quite a while to get them out. But all the time those conifers were in this ground, they were taking moisture and nutrients out of the ground. And if I were to put vegetables straight into this area this year, it's likely that it would have been unsuccessful. So what I decided to do was resist the temptation of planting vegetables this year and allow the ground to recover slightly. I did put some fish blood and bone into the soil and watered it in when I first took the conifers out. And what I'm going to do over the next month is cover this area completely in manure and leave it over the winter. And I'm going to allow the frost and the cold weather and the rain to take all those lovely nutrients out of the manure into the ground. And then when it comes to spring next year, I'm going to have some really good fertile ground to put vegetables in. Now, because I've got the YouTube channel, I'm trying to grow in different ways, because I realise that viewers who watch the channel, some will grow in raised beds, some will grow in pots and containers, and some will grow vegetables using traditional methods in beds straight into the ground. And that's what this area is here. Vegetables that we've just looked at are all vegetables grown in raised beds, but in this area here, this is going to be my traditional growing area. So those of you that grow veg traditionally straight into the ground will be able to see how I'm also doing that in this particular area over here. So even though I've not grown anything in this area just yet over here, you can see over here that I am growing some vegetables under this netting. And here I've got a combination of 3 cauliflowers, and behind them there is a couple of cabbage. The cauliflowers are a variety called All the Year Round, and the cabbages are January King 3. Although next year, because I do like cabbage, I will be growing other varieties as well. It's just that this year, it's just trying to maximise the available space that I've got, which is fairly limited, to be honest, compared to what I've been used to previously, but trying to make the garden as productive as possible. And as I've mentioned, not planting vegetables in areas that I know are going to struggle this year. As you can see, as these are brassicas, the cauliflowers and the cabbage, they're also covered up in scaffold or debris netting. They're actually doing really well. At the moment, there's no cauliflower heads on there yet, but they will come. I know, talking to a lot of vegetable growers and looking at some of the social media forums, some vegetable growers get a bit concerned where they're saying, well, I've got lots of lovely growth on my cauliflowers, but they haven't got any heads yet. Just be patient, they will come eventually. If you are experiencing dry conditions, then just make sure that they get plenty of water. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, at the moment that's not a problem in this area because of the amount of rain that we're having, but if it was a dry summer, these would need watering regularly to make sure that they get the right amount of moisture to help them grow properly. So I'm now going to take you to the back of my garden and show you how the potatoes are getting on. Now in my last plot tour in June, this area here was a massive growth with potatoes, and as you can see it's much more modest now. But since then, if you watch my channel, I put a video out about a month ago that shows you how these potatoes got blight, and I had to deal with them really quickly to save the harvest. And I will put a link to that video in the video description below, because it's important to recognise where you've got blight and where you haven't. And in that video I showed you that even if you have blight, you can still get a really good harvest of potatoes. Here I've got 4 containers remaining of my second early potatoes, a variety called Charlotte. And because they've had blight, I've cut the leaves and the stems down to the top of the compost. And I have harvested round about 6 or 7 containers already and got a fantastic crop from them. But these ones I've left in the containers. These will be harvested over the next few weeks, and by leaving them in the pots or containers, it just helps to harden the skin slightly, just to make them better for storage. Now I have got 6 containers of my main crop potatoes, a variety called Picasso, just further up the garden, and you can see those now, and they're growing really well. But when they are ready for harvest, and with the remainder of these, I'm going to get a good supply of potatoes all through the autumn and fall and into winter. So even though I have had blight, I'm actually really pleased with my potatoes. Now I've just moved up to the top of my garden, and this is the area where I'm growing most of my vegetables in containers. And in this area, as you can see, I'm surrounded by my cucumbers. I've got 5 cucumber plants. All of them are growing in builder's buckets. The builder's buckets I picked up for £1, or the equivalent of around about $1, and just drilled holes in the bottom, so you don't need to buy expensive pots or containers to grow vegetables when you can go down your local DIY store and pick up builder's buckets. These cucumbers are a fabulous variety called Market More 76, and I've grown them for years, and as you can see I've got plenty of healthy growth on them and plenty of decent sized cucumbers, and even cucumbers that are just growing that will develop into larger cucumbers, and we've already had quite a lot of cucumbers off these. You'll notice that I'm growing them up canes rather than allowing them to sprawl along the ground, and again that's a technique I've used for many years. You could let cucumbers sprawl across the ground, but there are disadvantages to that in terms of the amount of space they would take up in your vegetable plot, and also they'd be quite vulnerable to being eaten by possibly slugs or other insects, so it's always better to put them up canes. I've made a wigwam of 3 canes in each bucket and tied them together at the top. Then as the cucumbers grow and produce their side shoots, you can train the side shoots up the canes. It really is a fantastic and efficient way of growing cucumbers, and as you can see there's plenty of flowers on the cucumbers as well, which will be further cucumbers. Cucumbers are a particularly water hungry crop, and as long as you water them regularly you will get a really good crop of cucumbers. Every couple of weeks I will water them with some diluted tomato feed just to give them that extra boost, which is exactly what I'll do with the tomatoes, which we're going to go and have a look at next. Now this is one of my favourite parts of the garden, because you'll notice there's no traditional vegetable beds or raised beds in sight, because we're right next to my house, and therefore I've made use of containers to grow my tomatoes and peppers in an area that's seen very little growth of any sort in the past. Along this wall here I have a variety of bush tomatoes called Momande, which are doing absolutely fabulous. You can already see the green tomatoes already developing, and some of them are starting to ripen and go red already. These produce really lovely large beef tomatoes. I would recommend, if you've never tried Momande before, definitely try growing them next year. Just behind me along this wall over here are 5 red cherry tomatoes, so they're the much smaller type of tomatoes. I've already had an awful lot of tomatoes off those plants, and they're still producing many tomatoes. And what I've demonstrated by growing my tomatoes outdoors is that you don't need indoor growing space such as a greenhouse or a polytunnel to grow tomatoes in the UK. Yes, if you have got them, fantastic, and they will grow really well in there if you maintain them and look after them really well. But just because you haven't got a greenhouse or a polytunnel, it doesn't stop you growing tomatoes, as I've demonstrated. And you'll notice that I'm growing the tomatoes in 15-litre containers with garden canes to support them. These Momande tomatoes need less support than the red cherry tomatoes, because as you can see the red cherry tomatoes are quite tall. I've let the red cherry tomatoes grow to the top of the canes, and then I've nipped off the growing tips because I don't want them to grow any higher. That will do 2 things. Firstly, it will stop them growing higher, and secondly, it'll help the plant put the energy into the fruit or the tomatoes to make them much more productive. These ones here, I just let them grow. I will not nip off any growing tips on these bush tomatoes, because as the tomatoes have grown, as I've needed to, I've introduced more canes into the container and tied the tomatoes to them. And particularly this time of year when they do start to produce the tomatoes, you might need to introduce additional support because the tomatoes are quite heavy. What will happen if you don't is that as the tomatoes are produced, it could snap the branches or the vines that's holding them, and that could affect the tomato plants. Just like I mentioned for the cucumbers, I will water these with a tomato feed every 2 weeks at this time of year to help give them a bit of a boost. And you'll notice that in between the tomatoes there are smaller pots, and they're my peppers. So I've got 3 varieties of peppers. I've got DKN and jalapeno, which are quite hot peppers, and there's a variety of sweet pepper called California Wonder. They're growing really well at the moment. At the moment I haven't had too many peppers off them, but as you can see they are starting now to develop the peppers, and as hopefully we'll get some warmer temperatures soon here, that will help to boost the growth of the peppers, and I'm hoping for a really good harvest. And finally, these are my mini greenhouses, which have been fabulous. These were really cheap to buy and they have been an immense help to me this growing season. I've got a few things growing in here at the moment as seedlings. I've got a few lettuces growing, little gems, and I'm also starting a variety called Winter Density. I've got some rocket and I've got some Swiss chard as well as vegetables. Later this month I'll start more seedlings for my winter greens and my winter veg, and they'll be put into these mini greenhouses. I've also got herbs here in pots, basil which smells amazing, which I've grown from seed, and some sage which I took from cuttings. So herbs are something that are great for harvesting at this time of year as well. If you've got anything like rosemary, sage, thyme, there's quite a selection of herbs that I'm sure you might have in your vegetable garden. I also like growing flowers, and those of you who are flower growers, you'll notice that I've got some cuttings here from my fuchsia bushes which are around my garden, and they're developing really nicely. So as always in August, lots going on in the vegetable garden. I really hope you've enjoyed the tour. I'm really pleased as I've been going around showing you how well my vegetables have been growing, particularly as this is the first year that I've been growing a lot of vegetables in my garden, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. I hope also along the way you've picked up 1 or 2 tips for yourself. I'd love to know what you're growing in your vegetable garden, maybe something that's growing really well this year and maybe something that's not grown so well this year. If you could add a comment below and let me know, that'd be great, because it is really great to share experience with other vegetable growers. So thank you very much for watching the video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and if you want to subscribe to the channel for future videos on how to sow and grow fruit, vegetables and flowers, and 1 or 2 recipe ideas, don't forget to press the subscribe button, and I'll see you all on the next video.